Go ahead, just start it again. Just click the bar. Great. Good job, Ian.
Do it now.
Back one.
Good afternoon. Good to have you all with us tonight. We're going to be talking about pruning and maintaining shrubs, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. But we are recording this, and if you have questions, please go to the question and answer and put your questions in, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation.
So go to the next slide.
I'm Willis Lanier. I've been a master gardener since 2010. I do my own yard work except for the cut and blow. I've had a lifelong interest in gardening and agriculture, and basically I'm a farmer by heart. Today we're going to give some comments on why prune, pruning tools, pruning spring versus summer flowers, basic principles of pruning, and maintenance. Now, pruning is not for all plants, but you see in this picture, these plants have definitely been pruned. Why do we prune? We prune to maintain the shape of a plant, to maintain its size, to remove dead or diseased wood, to remove crossing branches, and to open it up so that air and sunlight can get into the center of the plant. That's also called thinning. Here's a picture of some plants that, although they were placed appropriately when they were little, some environmental reason, this plant has definitely outgrown its neighbor. You see these vertical plants, and there's a little one here, but this plant is going to definitely need some kind of pruning. The type of instruments that we use to prune are loppers and hand pruners. Now, there are several kinds of loppers. Loppers are used to cut limbs 1 to 2 inches, and this is the regular lopper that you see a lot of. It's a scissor action where you have 2 blades that cut like scissors. Now, another type of lopper is called a ratchet lopper. You see the ratchet here, and with this, you can cut larger limbs a lot easier than with a regular lopper. When you crank it down, these ratchets help it to cut and will cut a lot better. Now, hand shears also come in the scissor action, just like scissors, where you have 2 blades that approximate each other and leave a nice, thin, smooth cut. Another type of hand shear is called an anvil cut. And if you can see here, there is a flat bar where the top blade comes down onto it and almost crushes it to cut it. So you don't get quite as smooth, easy cut as you do with the regular shears. Now, some of your plants are going to be a little bit larger, particularly if you're going to be doing renewal pruning, and you may need to use one of these really neat knives or saws, little hand saw, get it into major hardware stores. But this works very nicely in cutting larger than 2-inch limbs and stems. So I think those are some interesting things. Now, when you are using these, we're going to talk about cleaning them a little bit later, but that's an important aspect of it too. Here is a little video on tools.
We're going to demonstrate some pruning this morning, but before we start pruning, we want to clean our tools. I've got some soapy water, rinse it off really good, and an antiseptic cloth that I'm just cleaning the tool with. When you're pruning, you don't want to spread disease from one plant to another. Not that any plant actually has disease, but we just want to make sure that we're not transferring a virus or bacteria from one plant to another.
We're also going to be talking about spring versus summer flowering. Spring flowering plants are plants that bloom in the spring, and of course, summer flowering plants bloom before new growth begins. The spring flowering plants generally bloom on old wood. General guidelines is that the spring plants bloom on previous year's growth, so you prune 1 to 2 months after the flower. Most spring and winter flowering plants are in this category. They bloom on current year's growth, prune late in winter and in the spring. Most are summer flowering. Now, exceptions are the gardenia, when you prune 1 or 2 months after they bloom. The Camellia sasanqua, prune March to May, and spirea depends on the type of spirea that you have. Now, these are some of the most common and best known spring blooming flowers. Forsythia, and I expect forsythia in the next 3 to 4 weeks or earlier. Spirea and azaleas. Spring flowering plants, again, we prune after flowering. And in reviewing what some of the spring flowering plants are, we mentioned the azalea, forsythia, oak leaf hydrangea, big leaf hydrangea, that's also called the mop head or big leaf, flowering cherry, flowering quince, dogwood, red bud, rhododendron, double foul, viburnum, wisteria, and spirea. The summer flowering plants are plants that you want to prune before spring growth begins. And this would include the camellias, Abelia nandina, Rose of Sharon, also called Althea, Spirea, Viburnum, Paniculata hydrangea, Mimosa, Japanese Spirea, crepe myrtle, sweet shrub, roses, both the floribunda and grandiflora. When you're pruning hydrangeas, it depends on the variety. Again, the macrophylla, also called big leaf, oak leaf, and serrata, bloom, and you want to prune them after they have bloomed. Early spring, before they bloom, you would prune the annabelles and paniculatas. Boxwoods really perform only minor pruning, but if you really have to, boxwoods also can be cut back pretty much if that is a real need. And holly, you prune December to July. One interesting fact about holly is that you can prune it pretty severely, and we'll show you again in just a moment about renewal pruning, and holly can withstand a pretty good bit of pruning. The needle evergreens, such as juniper, arborvitae, conifers, you want to be careful with pruning them. Don't cut them back very much, since their growth points are right at the tips. Do not cut into the old wood. That's wood without needles or leaves. Now, in the basics of pruning, most regrowth occurs within 6 to 8 inches of the cut. In pruning, we have heading and thinning. Now, you see here in the heading, where the plant is one basic shape and size. And thinning is just cutting out limbs that are taking up too much space or crossing over. This is where you're opening up the plant to get more air and sunlight. And this will help the plant to keep its more natural shape rather than having the rounded shape that we saw before. Now, when you thin a plant, if you can see, the cut is where the little red line is. The blue is the limbs that are going to be removed. And when you finish pruning this, your tree or bush is a lot more open than it was to begin with. Heading removes the dead section of the branches at the same height to make the tree or bush look fuller. You'll see again where the red lines are is where the cut is, and what is removed is the top of the limbs. We call it heading. And once you have headed it, you see it makes the bush more uniform and more rounded looking rather than the natural look. Now, these bushes, this shrubbery, has been given a pretty formal look where they've just gone in and headed it, and the shrubbery back here has a more natural look, but you can see these are rounded and sheared off the heads. Formal hedges, again, are like cutting off the ends and keeping it all smooth and one size and smooth rather than having the informal look of trimming each part. Now, when you make a cut in trimming a stem, you want to go right above the bud. Don't come down here in the middle, like here's a bud, here's a bud. Go right above the bud. You want to make the cut at about this angle rather than too severe of an angle. It leaves too much space on the stem that might accumulate water that would promote rot. When you cut, you want to cut just above the stem, not high above and not right on it. Now, I have a little demonstration I'd like to show you. This is an azalea, and we'll come to azaleas later, but we'll show you a little bit here. Now, when I'm talking about the bud, here's where the bud is, where those little limbs come out. But I'd like to remove this stem because it's just gotten a little unwieldy. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm making my cut just above the bud and a little less than a 45-degree angle makes a nice smooth cut. Now, when you're pruning your plant, you're looking at kind of making an upright shape or a spreading shape. If it's upright, you're going to need to cut limbs that are coming out to the side like this or up here, and try to keep your plant a little more upright. Now, in the shrubbery that we showed you in front of the house a few minutes ago, they're going to need to come in and trim that plant such that it has a more upright or maybe a little bit of spreading, but not the spreading and as tall as it is. In spreading, we're taking out limbs or from the inside of the plant and leaving the lateral limbs to look kind of like a vase. This is demonstrating the cut that I was showing a while ago. Now, if you're wanting this plant to spread, when you are looking at this stem, you're looking for a bud that faces out like this. Make your cut such that the bud is facing out either one side or the other. If this bud is facing in, you're going to encourage this kind of growth into the plant and not lateral to make it a spreading plant. So be aware of the little bud and which way the bud is facing before you make your cut. Here is this guy trimming his limb that has just gotten way out of line in comparison with the rest of his plant. He's going to give this plant a fairly good cut. He's cutting back about a third and has made a nice looking plant from that. We talked about renewal pruning. This probably is a holly. You can cut a holly back to 6 inches or so, and this also shows limbs that the little saw I showed you would be easy and better to use. After this plant has been pruned and given the renewal pruning, in a year or so, it's going to look like this. So renewal pruning, rejuvenation pruning, is not for the faint of heart. When you go in, you got this beautiful bush, and you say, guys, this is too big. I need this cut back. And you go in and you prune it like this, it shocks you. Can you imagine the shock to the plant? Renewal pruning is a little bit different, where you go in the first year and remove all but 2 to 5 major limbs. Year 2, you go in and remove the old wood that you didn't remove the first year. And by the 3rd year, your new shrub is smaller, better shaped, and then you go in periodically and prune out limbs that are beginning to cross over or look dead or are diseased. Now, the reasons to prune, we want to shape our plants. Sometimes we prune them to make them a little bit smaller. Rejuvenation, we talked about cutting it way back. And we talked about the types of pruning of heading, where you just smooth it off, rejuvenation, and thinning. We're going to talk about the timing of pruning in just a moment, but in general, spring blooming plants, you prune before July, and that's the same as encore azaleas, and native azaleas never need pruning. Here is just a little demonstration about pruning.
An azalea that has done really well. It's gotten a little bit out of shape from so much growth, and at this time of the year, we're in January, so we don't want to trim it until it blooms. But after it blooms, right after it blooms would be a good time to bring it down at least a third. And you can see these wild shoots have gone up here. You can trim all of them down, back down about a third. Now this particular one shoot here, you see instead of it being a long stem, is one that has just kind of come along by itself. Now, instead of trimming it here, you would leave this stem without any limbs on it. Our recommendation would be to go all the way back down as far as you can to take that limb out. That's not a very good, I don't like that one. Maybe we can redo that one. But anyway, now these are not leggy like that. They are coming out from the stem here where you've got these branches, and they could be cut in the spring here, and then that will kind of shape this up and get rid of the tall, leggy branches that have come up. Now, if you look here, again, this is what we're talking about, the trimming azaleas. You see the little bud there? You would trim it here, not here. So you want to make sure you got a little bud there. Now these big ones that have come out back here, you do the same way. You see how this comes to this junction here? Instead of cutting it up here, you cut it down here at the junction. And that way it'll grow better. And in the spring, now we're not going to cut them all back because we're going to let them bloom, but in the spring, you cut them all down, bring it down a third, and you would bring it down initially to where they have started branching in that little area there. Once you've cut this back a third, it's going to be really good shape and be ready to go for the next spring. You don't want to trim azaleas in the fall. You will probably reduce the blooming for the next spring, may even cut all the flowers off. So if you're going to trim your azaleas, trim them right after they bloom.
And going from azaleas to macrophylla or hydrangeas, by the way, that guy should have used his loppers to cut that long stem down toward the base. That would have been a lot easier. All right, now here we are in hydrangeas. As you know, there are several different types of hydrangeas. We have the macrophylla, the quercifolia, paniculata, the serrata, and the Annabelle, which comes in its own little category. In the macrophylla or mop head, it blooms on old wood in June. I recommend that you prune your mop head hydrangeas before July 15th. Now, some people like to leave the flowers on because they think that adds interest in the fall and winter, and that's okay. But if you're going to prune them, prune before July 15th. Lace scalp hydrangeas are in the same category with that. The oak leaf hydrangea, prune in early July, even though, it does bloom on old wood in June, like the mop head. Now, I think it's of interest, and it is interest to a lot of us for getting more into native plants, that the oak leaf hydrangea is native to Southeast United States. It has single versus multiple florets, and there are different varieties of it too. Now, the paniculata is the hydrangea that has the bloom that is kind of cone shaped. It blooms on new growth, so you're going to need to prune it in February so that you don't cut off any of the new growth. Again, we're repeating this a little bit because it's so important. The timing of pruning hydrangeas to maintain flowers for the next year is of paramount importance. People ask me all the time, well, why don't my hydrangeas bloom? And when I start asking when they had cut them or pruned them, they had done it at the wrong time and cut the buds off for the next year. So try to remember to prune your mop heads and oak leaves by July 15th. The paniculata and arborescens, which is the limelight, bloom on new wood, so you want to trim them in late winter, early spring before the new wood starts growing. The serrata, prune right after blooming. This is a little demonstration about paniculata.
This morning, we want to show you the difference between pruning panicle hydrangea, a mop head hydrangea, and arborescens hydrangea. This is a panicle hydrangea, and you can see that from these old buds. They're panicle shaped instead of being the mop head shape. So that's a good tip off. Now, in these hydrangeas, this is an excellent time of the year, late winter, to prune these because they bloom on new wood, not old wood. When we look at this one, it has several areas that need to be pruned. Now, this particular one could be brought down a third to help keep it more manageable in shape, and next year get new limbs to come out to bloom. But what we particularly want to do today is to look at some limbs, shoots that need to come out of here. You can see here, this particular one is going sideways. It's rubbing against this limb, rubbing against this one. So you want to take out all limbs that are rubbing against other limbs or going sideways, going in awkward angles. You want to leave the shoots that are going straight up or going at an attractive angle. Now this particular one, we're going to take out because it's rubbing against like 3 or 4 limbs. Now what I'm going to do is to prune this in such a way, I'll show you in just a second. We're going to take this whole limb out. Now what we've done here is to prune this so that it is at about a 45-degree angle with the face pointing out, not in. And the reason for the 45-degree is so that water will drain off when it rains and not tend to go into the stem that might cause rot. Now let's see if we can find another one that is doing the same thing. If you look here, this one is, you can see even where this is rubbed against this. Can you see that right there? See how that's rubbed it? So that is, needs to come out too. And we're going to do this the same way. Now when we trim, we go back down to a bud. You don't just trim it off here. You come all the way down. But you can see how that one is also rubbing against this limb. And what you want to do is get the main stalks going up. Now this one is rubbing here, so we're going to take it out. Okay. And what you want to do is to try to get rid of the stems that are rubbing, going horizontally, or dead, or diseased. Now, again, this hydrangea would be probably well served to cut it back about 1/3 to help get it back into a better shape for spring. A lot of people leave the flowers on, and that's fine. That gives it a little interest during the winter. So that's what we're going to do. We will be trimming this back 1/3, and we'll be trimming out the other limbs that are crossing and rubbing on other limbs.
The next thing we'd like to talk about is roses. And I think it's appropriate to talk about the hybrid tea rose today, since they're considered the Valentine rose. They're the ones who give us the great, long, beautiful stems that give you the long stem roses for Valentine's. We trim or prune the hybrid tea rose in the spring. And when you go to the hybrid tea rose, you want to get down close to the center of the bush and take out a lot of the growth that has come last year, because it's going to come again gangbusters this spring. And you may need loppers to get down into the center of the rose, primarily to avoid getting stuck by the roses. The climbing rose, you trim later on, and then there's the knockout rose that we're going to talk about next. This is the hybrid tea rose, and what we're looking for in trying to make it more of, again, a vase shape. So you come in here and remove a lot of these stems way down to the base, thin it out completely, and make it shape up a little bit. The climbing rose is one that during the summer may start overlapping. This may be a whole stem that's lying across the mother vine, and so it's shading it, cutting out the hair. You'll need, after these have bloomed and started going back, come in and remove that whole limb from that. You want to keep it such that air can get down into the plant and sun can get in it, but you want to prune it right after flowering. And going back to the hybrid here, you just want to make sure you're removing the unhealthy, diseased, or dead stems. And in the summer, you may need to go in, even though you've already trimmed it, remove some stems that are beginning to show up, that are beginning to get old or diseased looking. Now, everybody has the knockout roses, and they're just beautiful. In these knockout roses, you want to go back when you prune it, and this is, hopefully you can see this. This is where you have a stem, and again, we don't cut it between buds here or here like that. You want to come down to a bud that's got 5 leaflets and trim it again across the stem with a little slight angle and right at the bud, but not on the bud or too far away from the bud. So this is how you trim knockout roses, and they need to be trimmed and shaped pretty much during the summer. But you can trim them back if you need to. If you want to get this row of roses smaller, you'd go in and trim a third, and then after a month, go in and trim another third. And it's best to prune these roses in the spring. But every 2 or 3 years, you need to go in and take out a third of the knockout roses anyway, just to keep them in shape, keep them the size good, and just maintain the health of it.
Knockout roses live up to their name in our area. They are knockouts. They grow like crazy, and they really need to be kind of trimmed periodically to keep their form, keep their shape. But if you let it go and you haven't trimmed it quite as well as you might, in the summertime you could even cut back big limbs to open it up and open the plant so it gets sun and air. Now today we've got a well-shaped knockout. It's a little tall. We can take it back down to a third off, and we'll show you how to do that in a minute. Other than trimming it back for shape and keeping it manageable, we like to look for limbs that are crossing, just like we did in the hydrangea, and dead limbs, diseased limbs, take them out to begin with. If you can come in just a little bit, you can see this stem has died a little, and we're going to take it all the way down to a stem. And again, we're cutting it such that we're doing the shape. Now this one, we're going to take back to a 5-leaf stem. See, this has 5 leaves. That theoretically is the best place to cut it back to. Going to cut it, and we're doing that little angled cut again. Here's one that the whole stem looks like it needs to go. There's nothing on it. It's kind of bad looking. So we're going to come all the way back down to this stem and give it that little cut like that. This one you can see is rubbing against the fence here. We're going to cut it back down too. There we go. Now, some of these are just need to be taken out just because they're beyond what they should be doing. Now we're looking for limbs that cross each other. And you see how this one is beginning to come across and touch that one. We're going to take it out down to the stem here. And now that opens it up a little bit, gets rid of the crossed limb. Again, when you're cutting, theoretically, it's best to cut back to a 5-leaf little stem like that. We're not going to take that out, but that would be the best place to cut it. And this bush can be taken back a third to get it back down to a good manageable level. Let's take that one out. Back here, This one probably could come to here. This real tall one probably would do better to come back and get it down. Now this one we're going to take down to this 5 stem level here. And that gets rid of some of the height. And that little stem is dead. And there. Now, if you look, these are rubbing. So we need to maybe take this one out. There we go. And since this is a little taller than we like, we're going to take it back here. Now you see we've gotten rid of a lot of the height of this and yet maintained the shape. If you look, there's a little bud coming out right here. We're going to leave that and take that. We'll take this one back down to the stem with the leaf on it and trim the little dead part. Now you see we've gotten rid of almost a third of the growth and have shaped this up a little bit better than it was. There you go. Now, this summer, if it gets to growing too big, too much, you come out and you use the same principles where you cut it back to a 5 stem and looking for limbs that are crossing each other. See how wild that one is? Awkward angle, taking it out. And I think that one's trimmed up pretty good. Now, if you wanted to, you could take this big one out, but I think I'm going to leave that just to kind of keep it tall.
Now we come to everybody's favorite, crepe myrtle. This term was came about in the mid-70s, and it first appeared in the Southern Living magazine. The guy was talking about pruning crepe myrtles to the point that you see here with camel knees all over all the stems. This is a little video we're going to show you on crepe myrtles and talk about it later.
Straight pruning of crepe myrtles. This is one method of pruning where it's been pruned over the years and little shoots have come out from these like that. This particular one needs some pruning, some attention. We've talked about these cross limbs. You can see this one's going out to its side. So this particular method of pruning is what some homeowners own, so they can see the bottom, see through the bottom, and have the growth at the top. Let's go see another different pruning method. Straight pruning of crepe myrtles. This is one method of pruning where it's been pruned over the years and little shoots have come out from these.
Sorry about that.
Straight pruning of crepe myrtles. This is one method of pruning where it's been pruned over the years and little shoots have come out from these like that. This particular one needs some pruning, some attention. We've talked about these cross limbs. You can see this one's going out to its side. So this particular method of pruning is what some homeowners own, so they can see the bottom, see through the bottom, and have the growth at the top. Let's go see another different pruning method. This is another example of crepe myrtle that has been trimmed more traditionally. You see that the shoots around the bottom have been taken off. A lot of times in the spring, the little suckers come out. It'd be a good idea to cut those off. This has been trimmed up a little bit so that the canopy is not all the way to the ground and is a little more attractive for these beautiful limbs. Now the same principle holds true for trimming and pruning crepe myrtles as others. You want to get rid of limbs that are going at odd angles or sideways. You see this one is beginning to grow that way. It's not big yet, but by spring it would begin to encroach on this limb. So we're going to take this one out so that it doesn't rub against these. This whole limb looks good. There's one here that is beginning to encroach. We're going to take it off. The general rule about pruning crepe myrtles is you want it open enough that a bird can fly through it. You don't want it so closed up. So you take limbs out that are going at odd angles, crossing other limbs that have died or diseased. A crepe myrtle is ordinarily 20 to 30 feet tall. So if you're trimming your crepe myrtle to keep it low, you may want to consider replacing the crepe myrtle with some other plant that doesn't grow quite as tall. But crepe myrtles, their natural height is 20 to 30 feet. And I think you need to remember that when you put crepe myrtles. But keep them trimmed, keep them open, keep them such that you can kind of see through it so the air and the sun can get inside.
Here you see a crepe myrtle that has been trimmed that second way. If you're going to trim your crepe myrtle and prune your crepe myrtle, late winter is the best time to do that. This crepe myrtle, you can see, has an open base. The bark is beautiful on a crepe myrtle, so you could keep that so you could see it, and you see how tall it is. And in the summer, all of these limbs are going to have flowers on them. So how are your shrubs doing? Have your conditions changed in your yard? Has your tree canopy changed such that the sun is different from when you first moved in there? I know in my house, my canopy has changed in such a way that I have basically zero sun in my yard now. So I'm a big shade gardener, and that I think is more difficult than a sun gardener, but some people may disagree with me on that. But is your shade or the amount of sun still appropriate for the type of plants that you have? Have you planted your plants, your shrubs, too close to the house and they're just eating your front? Or have you planted them too close together so that it's such that you can't see through it? When you're putting your plants out, plan for the eventual size of the plant, just like we were talking about the crepe myrtle. If you're looking for a smaller plant, don't put that crepe myrtle there. It's going to just naturally grow to 20 to 30 feet. So think about your planting as you put them out and as you buy your plants. We do a lot of container gardening, and sometimes when we show the container gardens, they look a little bit sparse to begin with. Most people's idea is just a full pot of plants. But if you do that in 2 or 3 months, you're going to have to go in and pull some out, and they won't do as well. So again, think about the size of the plant for where you're going to put it. Also consider the drainage. Water is one of the worst enemies of plants, particularly in Georgia. Plants can have too little water or too much water. pH and the soil nutrients are good to know. If your plant isn't doing well, you may want to check that. You can do that through the county agent's office. But be aware of not only the pH and the soil nutrients, but particularly aware of your water. Now, mulching is really good, particularly here in the South. It conserves moisture, it helps keep the ground from crusting, helps prevent weeds, and it just helps to make some beds look more attractive. It also, in our hot summers, moderates the soil temperature, and as it decomposes, adds to the nutrition in the ground. We encourage you to use biodegradable mulch such as bark mulch, nuggets, pine straw, compost. When you're applying, put it 2 to 4 inches, keeping the mulch at least 2 to 3 inches from the stem of the plant that you're putting mulch around. Some people will put several layers of newspaper on the ground before they put the mulch out, which helps to suffocate weeds. Make sure that the base of your shrub is still above ground level and that you're not bringing your mulch into the actual stem of the plant. Watering is hard to do sometimes. We recommend about 1 inch a week for most plants. Once shrubs have been established, they can go for a week or so without watering. Now, hydrangeas and rhododendrons are another situation. You have to monitor them a little closer. You probably want to water them 1 or 2 times a week pretty deeply, depending on the rainfall. Now, some people use hands and nozzles, wands, sprinklers, drip irrigation, but we still go by about 1 inch per week. When you water before at night and before 10 o'clock a.m. to reduce the risk of fungus. Preventing weeds is easier than killing weeds. Mulch helps to prevent weeds. Pre-emergent helps to prevent weeds. Pre-emergent keeps the seed from germinating. It doesn't kill the seed or the plant once it's germinated. And it does not kill growing weeds or seeds in the ground. So don't use prune with fertilizer. The best way of controlling actively growing weeds is to hand weed. Be careful when you use Roundup or other broadleaf weed killers. This spring, you might want to try an instrument that a friend of mine introduced to me a couple of years ago. This is called a Dutch hoe. And basically the way you use it, you just scrape it. And so many of these early spring weeds are so superficial, this will just remove them so quickly and easily. So I encourage you to look into the Dutch hoe as a method of helping to maintain your weed population. Fertilizer is not normally used after a shrub has been established. Sometimes people would give it fertilizer and all it's doing is just making it grow faster. Pests are not usually a problem if the shrub is healthy. And as we have learned in our book club recently, and at some of our lectures about native plants, we're expecting a little more insect damage than we have approved of in the past. So give it a little break, use your sprays and systemics only when necessary. These are some sources of information. If you'd like, you can take a screenshot of that or come back and review these. But these, the North Fulton Extension Helpline, the University of Georgia publications at this website are just really good. So I'd encourage you, if you have questions, of course you can Google it, but this answers a lot of questions. And I'd say go to these and use these resources too. And more resources. We appreciate our sponsors, and these are some of the sponsors that we have. These are some of our promo sponsors, and we appreciate what they do for us too. We have some upcoming classes. The next one is March 8th, Protecting Georgia's Pollinators. And this should be a really interesting program. A lot of us are into trying to grow plants that are favorable for pollinators. And I think that you'll find in this talk that there are so many other pollinators other than bees and butterflies. Thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate it. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box. Tom, do you have any questions?
Thank you so much. Willis, this has generated some great questions, and I hope you can hear me okay.
I can, thank you.
A good number of them. I'll try to go as as the attendees have asked them, and we'll try to cover as many as we can here. I'll identify you only by a first name, so if there's more than one Michael or so on, you might realize that there were two of you, and you'll sort it out. Anyway, Lynn starts with a question that actually is less involved in the pruning issue, but a question of where the GMGA conference will be held this year. If I'm not reading my mail incorrectly, I believe it's October 1st in Augusta, Georgia, down
Thank
on the
you.
Riverwalk. If that's the case, Willis, you may know more than I do.
I think that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Easy to follow up with a Google search. Sherry asked about crepe myrtles. Do they actually require pruning? And although you did show us how, you might just mention if there's a necessity.
You do not need to prune crepe myrtles. What you would like to do is to keep the base clean. If little suckers come out, you get rid of them. You get rid of little limbs that come out along the base of the trunk. But as far as the canopy, you do not need to prune.
And I'll skip quickly to Sandra and to Michael, who also had a question about crepe myrtles. Sandra also asked basically the same question. Does it need pruning at all, or can it be allowed to grow? And I think you've answered that clearly. Michael did ask, do you take care to prune at an angle, or can you cut it straight across? I think that's important because I know my crepe myrtles sometimes have 2 or 3 inch thick limbs that I wish I had cut sooner. And then, of course, they have the very tiny ones that you've already discussed.
I think that in general, if you can cut it at an angle, 45 degrees or about, it would be better than cutting it straight across. And again, the reason for that is minimizing water getting into the stem that might cause rot.
I think that's great. And I agree with you that it's best not to cut into the main part of the stem or the trunk. Karen raised a question. Is it possible to revitalize? I think Karen means in the sense of a renewal, a conifer, that is a tree with needles, and for instance, a Leland cypress. She didn't mention that, but I assume that's one that's typical. You said to be very careful about the tips, but I think her question is, can they be renewed or revitalized?
Tom, I'd have to check on that. I would not want to be too dogmatic one way or the other, but to me, conifers do not rejuvenate very well, I wouldn't think.
I would agree with you. One other person asked for that to be gone over again. Of course, you can always go back to these workshop presentations and review everything we've talked about. But that seems to be a good question about to what extent and exactly where you would try to revitalize some of those fast-growing conifers. Then we move on to Sherry, who had a question about pruning a butterfly bush. We're all concerned about all of the butterflies that get through this area on their way south, and we want to make sure they have blooms. So any thoughts about doing away with some of those milkweeds or butterfly bushes too soon?
Okay, I misunderstood what you said when you added too soon. I understand now. No, I think that what you would want to do in that, if you really have to cut them back, trim them, probably would be best to do that late winter, early spring.
Makes sense. Louise asked a similar kind of question, but this was not so much about butterflies, but about tree olives. When would those particularly be best to trim?
Most trees are best to trim in the winter, and I would think that would be the best time to trim that.
Suzanne went on to ask a little bit about a fruit tree that has become too tall. I think she mentioned that she has a pear tree. And any advice about pruning a fruit tree?
All right, we're going to be having a program on pruning trees at a later date. This is beyond the scope of this talk tonight, and I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to that one. But I was asked earlier about pruning fig trees. And in the winter is the best time to prune fig trees. If you notice when you cut, sometimes you cut fig trees, a sap is released, particularly in the spring and summer. If you cut it in the winter, there's less likely for it to bleed like that. And there is really no need to put any kind of compound or something on these cut limbs. People ask that question too.
That makes good sense. All I would suggest is to underscore what you said about following some of the advice that you'll see on other programs that we have about fruit trees, because in fact, there's a difference in whether you get the best fruit advantage from trees that are pruned carefully for upright versus a spreading habit. And one is good in one way for some fruits and others for others. Susie asked about whether or not a large, I believe, same thing as she may have to send another Q&A to tell me if I got this wrong. But if there is a fruit tree that is 13 years old, about 5 feet high, and if that also requires pruning, but I think that would fall in that same category of waiting until we get some more information about fruit trees.
Right.
Adam asked about Loropetalum, one of my most beautiful, easy, and never able to kill plants. Loropetalum being a great kind of around the house plant, I guess. Any special advice about Loropetalum?
I think that they would be well to be trimmed late winter, early spring also, because you don't want to get rid of the little flowers that come.
You've already talked a little bit about camellias, japonica, susquana. Dave asked about a particular plant. He has a creeping dwarf gardenia.
Again, gardenias are in another little category. I would have to look back here about the gardenias. I guess the dwarf would be just about the same as with the regular gardenias, and you'd cut them 1 or 2 months after they bloom.
Okay. Becky had a good question about whether or not any of the cuttings made by way of pruning could be used for propagation.
Boy, I'm glad you asked that question. I love to propagate my hydrangeas, and I've propagated azaleas. Yes, you can propagate these plants. You can, if you propagate, look it up how to propagate, what tools to use, how to put it in sand or half sand, half peat moss to encourage the roots. But yes, please use these to propagate, particularly when you cut your hydrangeas. They root so easily.
And Joe asked about, going back to hydrangeas, asked about lace caps. Could you repeat the special advice about lace cap hydrangeas? Because he's getting a little bit of conflict from what you said with some of his gardeners.
All right, now what I've read is the lace caps and the mop heads basically are in the same category.
Okay.
And that would be pruning before July 1st. I'm sorry, before July 15th.
Mark asked about the beautiful knockout roses that we have all the time. And he wants to be sure that after it blooms, is it okay to trim off what he refers to as the fruit? I always thought of that as sort of the dead flower, but does that make sense?
Yes, I think that he's talking about that. During the summer, you want to trim the flowers that have gone back, call it deadheading. And there are some people who think that late in the fall that the knockouts like for you to leave the fruit, the little berry, after the flower has gone away, so the plant is signaled that it's coming winter and get ready for it. And that's what I've read.
Yep. And the last question that I've got here, unless I've missed some, I know I've missed some because I've sort of gotten to the point of stopping to be sure who was asking what. But one person wanted to know about trimming a yew tree. Well, excuse me, a yew bush, although there is a yew tree, of course. Actually, there are two kinds of yew trees. And if you had any suggestions about that.
Again, I would have to look that one up, but generally I would think late winter, early spring for you.
I would only add to be careful as you're doing that because there are parts of the yew plant, both tree and shrub, that are poisonous for animals and for people. Let's see, let me go on to some more here, as much as we have time for. Margaret asked if there is a particular good time to transplant, I assume she means transplant paniculata hydrangea.
Well, the best time to transplant any of these plants would be in the winter or real early spring. I wouldn't want to transplant voluntarily in the summer or early fall. Late fall is fine. But if there is an absolute need that you have to move this plant, try it. But the best time would be late winter, early spring.
Great. Yvonne wants to know if there is a best way to deal with Japanese beetles and rose bushes.
That's a great question. And I am at a real loss to give you very much information about Japanese beetles. Dish soap, dish soap in water will help. And you just kind of thump them off, spray them, but I really don't have much else to offer on that.
But don't forget, folks, if you have a question that we don't have the scope for to answer here, give it a try with the University of Georgia Extension program and see what they have too. Another person, Lane, wanted to know if azaleas can be cut back to the ground as much as holly.
If you read about azaleas, they can withstand rejuvenation pruning. I don't think they are quite as hardy as a holly in withstanding rejuvenation pruning, and I would go real carefully on that one.
Okay. Helga has an interesting question about water-loving shrubs in the backyard, which has a fair amount of shade, maybe 4 hours of sun, and where there's enough water after a rain that it begins to puddle a little bit. Do you have any recommendations about continuing to keep those shrubs in good shape?
Tom, I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
I think it's the question is, if you have too much rain and not enough sun for a water-loving shrub, is that okay for them to continue to receive that much wet?
Generally, even water-loving shrubs can get too much, and it might be a good idea to dig a little trench or something to help drain that area so the water doesn't just stand.
Good point. Charlene wanted to know if her muscadine vines, which are out of control, she didn't tell us what that meant, but we'll assume we know, and they're not producing much fruit. Can those be pruned way back?
Vines can be pruned way back. If you look at pictures of the vineyards, when the winemakers prune their vines, they go way back. I would say, yes, it could probably stand there, but I would really want to look that information up from the University of Georgia and know exactly what I'm doing. But I think the answer is yes, it can be pruned way back.
Regarding your loppers,
Yes,
Vivian wants to know if you have a recommendation about whether to sharpen or just simply replace.
sharpen. And if you go online, there are several places here in Sandy Springs, Roswell, Alpharetta area that will sharpen your loppers, your shears, your saws. You can find that online.
Okay. Retta asked about any special pruning for viburnums.
I'm sorry for what?
For viburnum?
Viburnum. Again, it depends on the type of viburnum that you have. And I would
I think
say,
she had a CHINDO.
okay, I'm not familiar with that one. I'm
I
sorry.
don't know that one.
But I would say again, know what kind of viburnum you have. Go to the our information, and it'll help you with that.
Ginger asked if there's anything special to do pruning wise if you want to develop a central leader for a large bush.
You go and you pick out the strongest vertical stem that you have, and then trim other stems that are in that such that it helps to get the shape that you want, but that central leader that you picked out to be the central leader is the one that you just kind of let continue to grow and not cut it way back, just kind of keep it trimmed up and in shape.
Sarah would like to get your advice about whether or not dyed mulches, which come in all kinds of colors, are any good.
Guide mulching?
Dyed, the ones that are
Oh,
dyed.
dyed.
Colors.
As long as they are going to, let me just say this. I don't think that artificial mulch is the way to go.
Good point. Ginger wanted to know about a Dahoon holly.
I'm just kind of lumping hollies in the same category. And again, if you got a specific plant that you want to know about, the best thing is to look it up in our literature, our references.
And how about a Rose of Sharon?
Rose of Sharon can be pruned. They're, as you know, they grow up, their natural tendency is to grow to be a tree rather than a small bush. So you would pretty much use the same rules about trimming Rose of Sharon as you do trimming trees.
And Shelley would like to know if there are plants that you recommend for the sides of a creek area to help absorb water. I get the gist of her question. She would like to, in a sense, hide or cover the water area. It's not a full flowing creek.
Well, there's certainly some trees and bushes that absorb and take up more water than others. Willows, for instance, love to be close to water. And again, I'm not at a position to answer that question 100% tonight, but you can find that information.
Okay. Any special advice on pruning a cuba?
I have a cuba that I prune. And again, that is the same kind of category as pruning in the winter or early spring before the new growth comes, because you go get the little flowers and berries on the new growth.
Okay. And we got time for one last question. Any special advice on pruning a weeping cherry tree?
No. Weeping cherries, again, that is in the category of trees, and it's not in the scope of this talk tonight. And I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to answer those questions.
Okay, that's the list of questions we have so far.
Tom, thank you so much. And guest, we really appreciate your attending and asking really good questions. And we hope to see you soon. Thank you.